Well, I so much want to thank my colleagues in this little confluence or conference that we've had for the really wonderful and scintillating, diverse, weird conversations we've been having, jiving with one another, clashing, and really enjoying each other's drift and dance. Especially want to thank John Katzenberg for inviting me to give this talk, and Jeffrey Keel for inviting me to the conference. And a big thanks to Sue Buckout for all that she's been doing to make this work. Thanks so much. It's obvious to me that the organizers were just rolling a set of dice when they, for some reason, asked me to give this talk, because there's innumerable brilliant voices at this conference who could wax even more eloquent than I up here. I'm still, believe it or not, trying to figure out exactly which of a couple different things to speak of here. Well, I'm gonna settle in with what we pitched, a rap on wonder and science and sensory experience. I mean, it's a curious but easily overlooked truth that the hand, this very organ with which we touch and explore the palpable textures and surfaces of the world, is itself a thoroughly palpable or touchable entity. It has its own smooth and rough textures, like the porous surface of a piece of fruit. This hand that touches things, in other words, is entirely a part of the tactile field that it explores. It is one of the textured inhabitants of this field, like the crumbling sidewalk, or a telephone pole, or like the clustered leaves of an old oak near your home. Wander over to that oak tree sometime, or to a maple or an alder. Reach out your fingers to make contact with it, to feel the surface of a single, many-pointed leaf between your thumb and the other fingers of your hand. Notice the coolness of that leaf against your skin, the veined texture your fingers discover as they roam across it. But note, too, another slightly different sensation. Notice that you are also being touched by the tree, that the leaf itself is gently exploring your fingertips, that its pores are tasting the chemistry of your skin, feeling the smooth and rippling texture of your fingers even as they move upon it. As soon as we acknowledge that our hands and our bodies are themselves included within the tactile world that they explore, we're forced to notice this reciprocity. Whenever we touch any being, we are also ourselves being touched by that being. But it's not only our tactile sense that has this curious reciprocity. The eyes with which we explore the visible world are entirely a part of the visual field onto which they open, yes? I mean, our eyes have their glistening surfaces, like the gleaming skin of a pond, and they have their colors, their blues or hazel greens or browns, like the hue of a leaf, or a patch of lichen, or the blue sky. And so when we stumble outside in the morning, rubbing our eyes free of sleep and gazing at the tree-covered hillside across the valley, our eyes cannot help but feel at that moment their own visibility and vulnerability. Our animal body feels itself exposed to that hillside, feels itself seen by those forested slopes. Perception, I want to claim, is this reciprocity, this intercourse far below our conscious reflections, whereby we experience the sensuous world only by letting our bodies be experienced by that world. Perception is nothing other than this ongoing interweavement wherein the terrain enters into us only to the extent that we render ourselves vulnerable to that terrain, allowing ourselves to be drawn into the depths of the living landscape. On some mornings, I step outside before pulling on any socks, before sliding my feet into their shoes. Sharp pebbles press into my flesh while other wider stones invite my feet to linger. The softness of the soil presses up against my feet and shapes itself to them, while the clumped grasses massage and wake up their souls. The drier, more resistant grasses prick and sometimes break under my weight. Ouch! Sending my feet back onto the smoother rocks. Here is the nourishing ground that my feet have forgotten in recent days. The pale stones are cool to my toes, the darker stones somewhat warmer. My feet receive directives from the ground, turning away from the browner brittle grasses, seeking the press of those greener blades that tickle and play against the thick skin, and then spring up again, slowly as I pass by. It feels good to brush against them, bringing my life into felt contact with these other lives, even if only for a moment. But how does my weight feel to those grasses, pressing and releasing? How do my steps feel to the ground as I walk upon it? Please try this, you guys, when the mood strikes you. Step out upon the solid earth, again, like when you were a kid, without the intermediary of a rubber or leather sole, without another creature's tanned hide coming between your flesh and the flesh of the earth. Notice the reciprocity in this contact, the way your feet pressing into the coarse ground are also being met by that ground. The pliant thickness of your feet being probed by the soil and the blades of grass. How easy it is to allow that the ground underfoot is the palpable surface of a living presence, and to sense that that depth feels your steps as you walk upon it. Watch how spontaneously your feet slow their pace in order to respect this odd otherness, in order to reply appropriately to the caress and the steady support of that depth, and to avoid insulting the sensitive ground with your carelessness. An old ancestral affinity between the human foot and the solid ground is renewed and steadily replenished by the simple act of stepping outside without shoes. Shoes, of course, are necessary accoutrements of civilization, eloquent in their simplicity, but we overuse them. And so forget that our feet, those downturned hands at the end of our hind legs, are sense organs as well as tools for transport. We release our nether appendages from these constraints only at night, when we unlace our artificial hooves and leave them by the bedside, swinging our legs under the covers. Only then are our feet free to really explore the sensuous field, our toes exulting in the rippling sheets, our soles caressing the cool skin of a lover's thigh. But as crucial as it may be for the sustenance of our hearts, and indeed for the perpetuation of our species, the sleepy attraction between one naked body and another is but a quiet reflection of the more ongoing and insistent eros between our body and the breathing earth. In truth, I think the most intimate meeting between the human body and the earth is not just at the bottom of our feet, but along the whole porous surface of our skin. Because the earth is not merely that opaque and implacable presence underfoot, it's also the transparent atmosphere that enfolds us. The space between a soaring raven and the bouncing branch of a spruce from which that raven launched itself a minute ago, it's not at all empty, hardly a void. It's thick with swirling currents, adrift with pollens and the silken threads of spiders, an invisible medium instilled with whiffs and pheromones and other subtle messages passing back and forth, all riding the unseen flows that compose the air of this breathing world. And we are not just immersed in this invisible medium. We are participant with it, inhaling this mystery through our nostrils, drawing it down into our lungs, metamorphosing it there, exchanging certain vital gases or elements with others before we breathe it back into the world. So the carbon-rich air that we exhale provides ready nourishment for the green and growing plants that surround us, and they in turn transform the vital air in the course of alchemizing sunlight into matter. And the oxygen they breathe out, we breathe in. The unseen atmosphere, in other words, is a subtle ocean continually generated and rejuvenated by the manifold entities that dwell within it. It's the planetary medium of metamorphosis and continual exchange between animals, plants, and diverse microbial critters, between the soils and the waters and the weathered rocks. The very archetype of spirit. The wind is a mystery both invisible and ungraspable, and yet it's entirely palpable. We can feel the wind moving against our face and riding the curve of our ears. We can feel it tugging our hair on our heads and rolling along the tiny follicles on the backs of our hands. Can feel the air part around our wrists as our arms slice their way through the unseen thickness. And just as, if we attend closely, we can sense the swiftness or slowness of its motion, or the dryness, moistness of its touch, so we can also sense the breeze tasting our qualities as it brushes against us, sampling the intensity of our sweat, the moist or dry texture of our skin. We can feel it lambent on our shoulders, can feel the breeze's caress on our ankles and its tickling play on our spine as it slides under our billowing shirt tails. We can feel it envelop and settle around us as it takes a mold of our shifting shape. If we assent to its fluid inquiries, allowing and quietly replying to its subtle explorations along the surface of our skin, then our actions take on a new power and elegance, the liquid grace that flows from an ongoing and improvised dance with the sensuous medium that surrounds us. And as breathing, you see, involves an oscillation between exhaling and inhaling, offering ourselves to the vast world at one moment and drawing the world into ourselves at the next, so sensory perception entails a like reciprocity, feeling ourselves touched by the things around us, even as we explore them with our fingers, gazing the mountains at one moment, and at the next moment feeling ourselves seen or sensed from that distance. Does there happen to be any water or a bottle of water in the... Ah, great. Thanks. Okay. Spring. And spring's intensity is finally bursting out of the branches where I live in northern New Mexico. The swooning scent of the blossoming lilacs makes my nostrils flare, triggering a faint memory of some giddy childhood transport. I stand still, eyes closed, sipping the sweet air with my nose. Oh, but just then another darker smell floods in and jumps my undefended neurons, making me wince. I recently began a new compost pile behind a near juniper. Orange rinds, leftovers left too long in the back of the fridge, lettuce leaves turned brown and oozing, scraps and scrapes of this and that, all merge into a pungent, slightly acrid rumor that drifts with the breeze. I head uphill, and that whispering stench fades into the green of needles and the silent needled air. A mosquito glides by and then circles erratically back, following a ribbon of scent to where it alights on my sleeve. I brush it free, and it drifts off a couple feet, then begins to hover near my head, bouncing up and down as on a string. After 2 or 3 circuits, it swerves down and settles on the same forearm, just beyond my rolled-up sleeve. I swivel the arm up to eye level in order to look closely at this creature. The mosquito seems oblivious to my gaze, or doesn't care. She's already bracing herself against my arm and piercing my skin with her long proboscis. I retain or restrain my impulse to brush this annoying visitor away, aware for once that here too is reciprocity. Because if I am able to smell the zinging scent of the piñons or the strong fermentation of the compost, it's only because I too am a part of the olfactory field. Because I have my own musk and effluvium, my own chemical emanations, which any mosquito can pick up and follow back to my body and its skin. And since I also take pleasure in sampling the world's tastes, since I can chew and savor the leaves of coriander and parsley in the neighbor's garden and enjoy the sharp tang of mustard on my tongue, or the delicious flavor of the crusty olive bread cooling on its wood in the kitchen, I know well that I too must have my own tastes, my delectable flavors, my tartness and bitterness, my dark aftertastes. As an omnivore, eater of the flesh of both plants and of sundry animals, willing to taste almost anything, and thus kindred in my gustatory and cognitive curiosity to most other omnivores, to bear and raven and raccoon, I find myself entwined in a great gift economy, wherein each life partakes of the gift of other lives and gives of itself in return. No matter how earnestly we humans strive to exempt ourselves from this economy by dissociating from our animal bodies or trying to eradicate every disease to which we are susceptible, by sealing our remains within lead-lined caskets, we can't escape from our participation in the cycles of exchange. If we ingest the land's nourishment, not only through our eyes and our ears, but also through our hungry mouths, chomping leaves and seeds and mussels with our teeth, moistening them with our saliva and swallowing them down into our depths, incorporating the world's flesh into our own. It can only be because we too are edible, because we too are food. I watched the mosquito's abdomen fill up with my blood. Countless times I have quashed mosquitoes with a slap against my arm or else brushed them angrily away. But today I just watch, humbled, ashamed to be offering only this tiny sip of my blood in return for the manifold sustenance I draw from the earth, but still glad to confirm my membership in the big web of interdependence as both eater and eaten. We can sense the earth around us only because we are entirely a part of this earth. Because by virtue of our own carnal density and dynamism, we're wholly embedded in the thick of this world. We naturally have access to the sensible textures, sounds, and shapes of the world because we too are tactile, audible beings in our own right. We are born of these very waters, this very air, this loamy soil, this sunlight. Nourished and sustained by the substance of the breathing earth, we are flesh of its flesh. We are not pure minds, but are sensible bodies, able to be seen, heard, tasted, and touched by the things and beings around us. Now, there are ways of speaking that honor this consanguinity, and so encourage and enhance this reciprocity between the human creature and the more than human earth. But there are also ways of speaking that implicitly deny this conviviality. Styles of speech that stifle the spontaneous participation and exchange between our senses and the sensuous terrain. The familiar discourse of objects and objective processes, for instance. It resolutely holds us aloof from the sustaining earth, forces us to disengage from our bodily senses and to view this wild and flourishing world as though we were spectators coolly observing it from outside. When we uncritically allude to the earthly surroundings as a set of passive and inert objects, or as a clutch of determinate mechanisms, we deny the ongoing and ambiguous interplay between our sensing body and the earthly sensuous. We deny our felt experience of a land that compels the curiosity of our senses because it never reveals itself all at once. We deny the encounter with trees, birds, and boulders that hold our attention only by concealing various aspects of themselves from our immediate apprehension, and thus beckon our animal bodies into a kind of silent dialogue, a conversation without words. To speak of an aspen or a boulder as a determinate object is to push into unconsciousness my direct experience of aspens and of boulders, and to contradict my bodily awareness of them as enigmatic and ambiguous beings with their own ways of influencing me, their unique styles of interaction and unfolding. It's to contradict my felt sense of the rising moon as a living power, as an interlocutor. And so, to speak of the more than human world of nature in strictly mechanical or determinate terms or even to speak of our earthly environment in a purely functional manner as our, our human life support system. But this contravenes and cuts short the conviviality between our senses and the earthly sensuous, stifles and stymies the spontaneous life of our senses. Our eyes begin to glaze over. Our ears become deaf to the speech of things. What we say has such a profound influence on what we see or hear or even taste of the world. So listen, when I was a high school student in the 1970s, I was much impressed by an earnest physics teacher, rather more laid back than the rest of the faculty. He seemed at first more approachable than the others. Although after several attempts to speak to him, I realized that he actually had little interest in listening or trying to understand my questions and was far more concerned to get back to his notebooks. A few weeks into the course, he was sitting on the table at the front of the classroom, and he told us wide-eyed that the apparent solidity and palpability of that table he was sitting on was just an illusion, because the table in truth was constituted almost entirely of empty space. Vast, yawning expanses of emptiness shot through with various infinitesimally small and feverishly whirling particles. I couldn't help but wonder why, then, the table still held him aloft, suspended 3.5 feet above the classroom floor. I stuck my hand in the air, waving it back and forth, swishing it, to catch his attention. How come, then, you don't fall to the floor? I asked. Because, he said, my body, too, is just a bunch of empty space, whizzing with particles. But this explained nothing whatsoever about why his apparent bulk still seemed to be supported by the wooden tabletop, or why, for instance, his ostensibly empty and illusory flesh did not just sink into and merge with the voidness of that table, or why he and the table did not merge with the emptiness of the floor. It explained only why I should no longer trust my senses and should accept that the unseen dimension of subatomic particles, that esoteric world of electrons and now of gluons and mesons and quarks, was in fact a truer, realer world than that which my bodily senses showed me. For several days, I wandered about in a state of intellectual bedazzlement, aware for the first time that everything I saw with my eyes was a mere illusion, and excited that I, alone among the citizens surging past me on the sidewalk, knew the hidden truth. Or at least that I knew someone who did know that truth, or who said that he did. Gradually, over the course of several weeks, I discovered that a certain kind of provisional trust in the evidence of the senses was entirely necessary to accomplish the simplest tasks, like walking to school or exploring the overgrown stream bed behind the old baseball field. But my exploration of that stream no longer held as much fascination for me as it did a few weeks earlier. If the visible world was in truth an illusory effect of realer events unfolding in the subatomic world, then I could no longer really learn anything of significance, I thought, by gazing at the water striders or listening to the thrumming rhythm of the frogs. If I wished to know anything of what was really real, I would have to apprentice myself to those scientists who were conversant with that hidden dimension, those whose access to high-powered instruments enabled them to peer behind the perceivable world and glimpse its source. So I began to read feverishly in the arcane world of subatomic physics, trying to glean whatever I could. Fascinating at first, but I soon grew despondent. I was spending all my extra time hunched over papers that I'd copied from journals on the squeaking Xerox machine in the back wall of the library, and my body was not happy about this. The prescription for my recently acquired eyeglasses got stronger, while my skin wondered what had become of the wind that used to rush along my face when I was cycling around the towns and narrow woods of suburban Long Island. No doubt the wind was still there, but I wasn't. I was nose deep in these books, trying to decipher a language that had nothing, as far as I could tell, to do with the remembered sound of the stream gurgling along the rocks or the glistening eye of a half-submerged frog. I really missed those frogs. So what if I couldn't yet gain access to the subatomic world with its ultimate truths? It gradually dawned on me that it was biology I should be studying. So the following year, I gave myself to biology with a vengeance. This was the science for someone like me, yeah? A kid uncomfortable hanging out with other kids for too long, who instead enjoyed spending his time in the woods listening to the way the trees rub against each other and staring up at the leafless branches jutting like weird hands into the sky. It was good to be back in the same world as the frogs and the water striders. Puzzled me at first that biology was taught entirely indoors, in a laboratory-like classroom, kind of like this, desks like that. But I secured a desk location close to the window. And when during lectures my attention drifted out beyond those panes of glass, I felt less guilty about it than I did in the other classes. I mean, this was biology, right? Study of life and of living things, and so I felt justified gazing at the underbelly of a beetle walking up the outside of the window, or a couple barn swallows chasing one another, swerving and dipping in the suburban sky. But then the teacher announced we'd be dissecting frogs the next week. After class, I walked up to him. Mr. Warasilla, where are these frogs gonna come from? He told me that they were shipped over. They were being shipped over for the express purpose of being dissected. Are you sure they're not from around here, I asked. Positive, he said. All right. I headed out across the field as soon as class was over, and I ducked under a few trees, sat down by the stream. I wanted to consult the local frogs about this new situation. I sat there, I remember, for a long time, but none of those big-eyed creatures turned up. Until much later at dusk, I heard first one frog and then another, but there wasn't enough light now to locate them with my eyes. So I just sat there and started talking to them, asking if they thought it was okay to dissect some other frogs in class. Whenever I started talking, they quieted down. And then after I stopped, there'd be a long pause, as though they were maybe thinking about what to say, and then they'd start croaking again. And, I knew perfectly well that they were not really replying to what I'd said, but it had the rhythm of a conversation. And so I listened close to their deep calls and then cut in and tried to justify what I'd be doing in the laboratory next week. And they'd fall silent once again at the sound of my voice, and so we went back and forth, and, for a while. I guess I came away feeling that, okay, well, maybe it was okay to dissect some of their distant relatives, since it was all in the name of learning the truth about the world. Following semester, however, biology class began to focus upon the molecular basis of inheritance. It was only then that I learned that the behavior of all these animals was basically programmed in their genes. This piece of knowledge, as it sank in, reverberated through my own organism, transforming my experience of the animate world around me. It seemed to alter my experience, to alter the very openness and attunement of my senses. My ears, for instance, became increasingly oblivious to the many non-human voices sounding from the trees and the hedges in the backyard. The songs of the thrushes and of the cardinals and blackbirds and all the other wingeds that had previously held me rapt with fascination began to fade from my awareness. My ears, that is, were no longer grabbed by their songs and cries. My hearing could not so readily focus upon whatever was being said by those birds. Precisely because those birds, it seemed to me, were no longer really saying anything. In tandem with my biology text, I had defined away all of the meaning. These were no longer the earnest cries of creatures actively expressing themselves, actively making sounds, or making meaning in the present moment for one another. It was just automatic sounds, programmed, as it were. And because I had defined away all of the active openness and creativity in those voices, because there was no longer anything actively being said by those birds, my ears found little purchase in those sounds, little to draw their participation, no enigmatic openness or otherness to compel their listening. And so the songs and calls faded into the background of a life increasingly focused on exclusively human concerns. no longer enveloped by a many-voiced world as alive and weirdly mysterious as my own sentient self, my own animal senses began to shut down. My eyes were no longer dazzled by the insects creeping in the tall grasses by the train tracks, or by the high-stepping poise of the heron at the local marshland, and my ears gradually became deaf to all that did not speak in words. It seemed as though my skin itself became less porous, less permeable to the abundant life that surrounded me, as my conscious self steadily withdrew from its participation with sensuous nature and began to live more and more in a clutch of abstractions. The senses, I was told in my science classes, were deceptive. I got this in my freshman year as well, college. The senses were not to be trusted, I was told, for the real truth of things was inaccessible to the unaided senses. It was hidden entirely behind the scenes, whether in the super small world of electrons, neutrons, and quarks, or in the ultra-distant world of the Big Bang, or whether tucked inside our skulls in that dimension of neurons and neuronal synapses that ostensibly determines all our experience, or hidden within the nucleus of our cells in that molecular realm of the nucleotide sequences or genes that presumably cause all our curious behaviors. The world accessible to my senses, the visible world of ground and rain and spiders, swooping swallows, came to seem a secondary dimension, a largely illusory world of appearances waiting to be penetrated and dissipated by the human mind. The animate nature that our senses showed us was no longer fundamental, and thus few people seemed to be particularly upset about the rapid destruction of forests and wetlands, or the accelerating extinctions of diverse critters and plants. Sensuous nature, after all, was a derivative reality, a realm useful for extractable resources, or as a dump site for the toxic byproducts of human progress, but not worth worrying about really, since we could readily replicate whatever we wish of this terrain using gene splicing, or we can engineer it with our genetic technologies or with nanotechnology to suit our desires. Few of us realize that all of these technological dreams, like all those abstract and exclusively human dimensions hidden beyond or behind or underneath the sensuous surroundings, were still secretly rooted in the world of our direct sensory experience. And hence we're still dependent upon our everyday encounters with the local earth around us. And this is the main argument I'm wanting to frame here. So I ask you to listen to this. It's so simple, it's so obvious, but I've never heard it quite stated, and I'm trying to find a way to articulate this. That, when I was younger, I just didn't suspect that, and nor did all of my fellow science students suspect that that our bodily awareness of the winds and the waters and the ground underfoot provided the necessary ground for all of those abstractions that we were studying, and was the sole guarantee of their coherence. It's only now, as we find both our lives and our high-tech laboratories threatened by the steady warming of the atmosphere, as we watch wetlands disappearing and forests dying off, and realize that our own children will not be exempt from the violence that our onrushing progress has inflicted upon the breathing earth. Only now do we notice that all our technological utopias and dreams of machine-mediated immortality may fire our minds, but they cannot feed our bodies. Indeed, most of this era's transcendent technological visions remain motivated by a fright of the body and its myriad susceptibilities, by a fear of our carnal embedment in a world, a wild earth that's ultimately beyond our control, by our terror of a world that offers us its abundant sustenance, at every moment. To notice this abundance, to awaken to the steady gift of this sustenance, entails that we offer ourselves in return, that we accept the difficult mystery of our own carnal density and mortality, accepting that we are bodily creatures that must die in order for other lives to flourish. But it's this we cannot bear. We're too frightened of shadows. We can't abide our vulnerability, our utter dependence upon a world that can eat us. Vast in its analytic and inventive power, modern humankind is crippled by a fear of its own animality and of the animate earth that enfolds us. Okay, so the language I'm saying first here, the language that refers to nature as a conglomeration of inanimate objects and determinate processes steadily isolates us from our senses and from sensuous nature, deepening the distance and the opposition between our intelligence and the grassy field. But there are other styles of discourse that stir our senses from their slumber, other ways of speaking that can resuscitate and renew the forgotten solidarity between the human animal and the animate earth, I think. Words and phrases that respect the ultimate unknowableness of things, not only of other people, but of frogs and juniper pollen and the shifting progress of a rainstorm. Ways of speaking that accord a certain enigmatic openness and otherness, even to antlers and rocking chairs and electric light bulbs that startle us with their sputtering, and to the moon, of course, but also to dwindling rivers and skyscrapers, and even to words themselves. Such are the kinds of speaking that begin to wake up our skin, I think, calling us back inside the body's world. I mean, there are, of course, an inexhaustible range of distinctions to be drawn between the sensuous phenomena of this world, but each particular presence that we meet partakes of a common mystery, the unfathomable upsurge of existence itself. Each thing expresses this mystery in its own manner and style, yet each is equivalently outrageous. A clump of dirt no less than a roaring, marauding bear, each enacting its own tenuous and improvised way in the world, each gifting its own rhythms to the riot of life that surrounds it. Every gust of wind, every note ringing forth from the bell tower, each staccato step of the water strider along the stream's surface has its own subtle influence upon the beings around it. Bare existence is already active, and hence no phenomena is utterly passive without influence or efficacy in the world. To allow this influence into our speaking, to affirm the unique dynamism and power of the many entities that we meet in the course of a day, to acknowledge that each presence that snags our attention has its own weird, mysterious life, is inevitably to begin to open our stifled senses. Why is this so? Why should such an animistic way of speaking, one that assumes some modicum of creativity and life in even the most obstinate of phenomena, and which therefore speaks of things not as fixed and finished objects, but as animate subjects, as living powers in their own right, why should such a way of talking renew and rejuvenate our bodily senses? Well, first, because it opens the possibility of interaction and exchange, allowing reciprocity to begin to circulate between our bodies and the surrounding earth. If we speak of the things as inert or inanimate objects, we deny their ability to actively engage and interact with us. We foreclose their capacity to reciprocate our attentions, to draw us into silent dialogue, to inform and to teach us. But as soon as we allow the things their own enigmatic openness and otherness, then our breathing bodies find themselves accosted, affronted, massaged, and ensnared by a host of charismatic powers vying with one another for our attentions. We're suddenly surrounded by a crowd of alluring shapes and rhythms, some of them shy and some of them shameless, each of which provokes the imagination of our eyes or the curiosity of our ears, coaxing our senses into a new alertness, a new conviviality with the local earth. Second, such a language makes evident the consanguinity between ourselves and the enveloping terrain, invoking an explicit continuity between our lives and the vigor of a land that is itself alive. It implies that the creativity we find in ourselves has its corollary in the surrounding cosmos. And two, that the relative stubbornness and solidity we associate with the things and elements that surround us have their corollary in the weight and inertia of our own lives, in the density of our flesh and the intransigence of our habits. By implying that each mountain, each cloud, each wolf or tree or hive of bees is a distant variant of our own texture and pulse, and conversely that our own sentient organism is itself a variant of the things, an intensification or fluctuation within the sensitive flesh of the world. Such a way of speaking then situates the human intellect back within the sensuous cosmos. It subverts the long isolation of the thinking self from the perceptual world that it ponders, suggesting that we and the surroundings are woven of the same fabric. Indeed, that we are palpably intertwined with all that we see and hear and taste, that we are entirely a part of the animate earth. And third, by describing the manifold things around us as unfolding, animate beings, we bring our language back into alignment with the ambiguous and provisional nature of sensory experience itself, with the fact that we never perceive any entity in its entirety, but only encounter partial aspects according to the angle or mood of our approach. We may conceptualize the things of the world as determinate phenomena, as fixed and finished objects, resting complete in themselves, but we can never really perceive them as such. We cannot experience any entity in its totality because we are not pure, disembodied minds hovering outside the world, able to view every nook and cranny from a God's eye perspective, but we are palpable bodies with our own opacities and limits. We're in and of the world, corporeally situated in the same rain-drenched field that the rocks and the ravens inhabit, and so can come to knowledge only sideways by interacting with other entities over time, crossing paths with them, sometimes lingering, responding to a thing's sparkle or its calloused coolness, slowly becoming acquainted with its characteristic textures and styles, the unique manner in which it resists our assumptions. All our knowledge in this sense is carnal knowledge. It's born of the encounter between our body and the cacophonous landscape that we inhabit. We know the things of the world not, in truth, as determinate objects, but as acquaintances and strangers, as trusted familiars and troublesome neighbors, as allies and misfits and moody, dangerous colleagues or comrades. Sometimes, like the night sky, some things, like the night sky, command my stunned silence and awe. Others, like my house, I tend to take for granted, though it steadily shelters me and holds my toothbrushes. Still others, like a book I may be writing, are both alluring and inscrutable. I know not whether their apparent aloofness is because they disdain me or because they are shy, whether I should approach them or keep my distance. All of these beings, whether familiar or strange, agitated or at ease, are participant with me in the ongoing emergence of the real. Not one of them, in my direct experience, is utterly inert or inanimate. Or is it? What of the plastic spatula in the sink? Or the tax return we have yet to fill out this year? Oh God, August 15th, yesterday. Or the computer dozing, unplugged by the wall. I mean, really, let's face it, that computer is not, in actuality, really sleeping. It's just turned off, Abram, and hence not computing, not really functioning at all at the moment, except as a fancy paperweight, with all its complex and compacted circuitry immobilized and, inert. It's just there. An ingeniously fashioned mass of plastic and silicon that could never have been built were it not for the cool detachment of the analytic mind with its propensity to step back from the world, to hunt for underlying mechanisms, to objectify and tinker with things. I mean, an understanding of the world in analytic and object-like terms is part and parcel of our reality. It is by now built into many of the artifacts we use and many of the institutions we rely upon. Hence, it seems unlikely that the detached, objectifying stance toward the things and processes of this planet will dissipate anytime soon. And for God's sake, why should it dissipate? Think of the astonishing insights and capabilities that this stance has brought us. And I'm absolutely serious here. I mean, the chemical table of the elements, the power of rapid transport and even flight, instantaneous communication links to almost anywhere on the planet, not merely technologies that can deaden the mind or deplete the earth, but many sustaining ones as well. The conquest of debilitating diseases, bioremediation of toxins, sophisticated solar, wind-driven engines. Isn't there something worthy and right, then, about our objectifying understanding of nature? And about the myriad insights that have been garnered from this perspective, the facts and explanations harvested from the careful practice of our sciences? Yeah, certainly there is. And nothing I am saying this evening is meant to disparage the elegant disclosures revealed by our sciences, or even the detached states of mind necessary to derive those insights. But I mean only to point out that the detached stance proper to science is itself dependent upon a more primordial reciprocity between the human organism and its world. It's this older and still ongoing participation that has gradually shaped the glistening eyes with which we now view the lights and shadows of this sphere, as it has shaped our listening ears, able to detect a wide range of sounds vital to human life, and yet oblivious to many other critters. This ageless entanglement between the human body and the animate earth, this coevolution, has shaped the senses and tissues of every earthly organism, deepening the color of our feathers and the power of our claws, heightening the bitterness of our leaves, and outfitting our seeds with cotton sails so they'll blow far on the summer winds. The practice of science may enable us humans to provisionally step aside now and then from our immediate involvement in the coevolutionary exchange. But it is this underlying entanglement and participation with the world around us that has formed the very eyes that now peer through our microscopes, the very intelligence that now interprets the data. The intrepid investigations of diverse scientists have yielded a range of insights that might, rightly understood, be of benefit not only to humankind, but to the entire complex of earthly life. But in order to attain these insights, our scientists have had to assume a God's eye view of the world, feigning a detached and disaffected perspective, pretending for the duration of their investigation that they were not themselves embedded in the very system that they were studying. During the course of each experiment, the scientist has to pretend that her observing intellect can break itself free from the myriad unconscious biases and limitations of her particular body and from the proclivities of this primate species that we are, in order to observe whatever unfolds as a wholly, disinterested spectator, as an utterly objective rationality, a pure mind. Now, as a temporary and provisional stance, the assumption of a sheer objectivity has been immensely fruitful, and it's resulted in a remarkable range of useful evidences. But while the individual practitioners of science, must ultimately revert back to their everyday lives as participants in the same world that they study. The language, the lingo in which their evidences are couched remains in the detached and disembodied mode. Our experimentally derived insights, that is, are preserved in the highly abstract discourse ostensibly necessary to communicate those insights to other researchers who are feigning the same detached or severed state of mind. There is rarely any translation back from the pretense of a pure disembodied rationality to a language appropriate to our lived engagement and participation with the life around us. Any such translation, of course, would need to render those insights in a manner accessible to our felt bodily experience. And still more important, would need to correct for the distortions induced in the interpretation of the raw data by the provisional pretense of a disincarnate perspective, of a view from nowhere. Since no such translation is available, since every scientific investigation builds on previous investigations without translating the results of those prior studies into the language of direct experience, a host of abstract and provisional worlds is gradually built up by our diverse sciences, a multiplicity of arcane dimensions hidden beyond, behind, or beneath the experienced world. Such are the supervast realms of galactic clusters and of black holes, or the quantum realms explored by high-energy physics, or the molecular dimension of DNA strands concealed within the nucleus of our cells, or the tangled forests of axons and dendrites hidden behind our brows. Since these recondite realms are entirely hidden from the direct experience of our unaided senses, the populace, that is, us, those who are not working in the scientific laboratories have to rely on various experts to mediate and interpret the deep truths that are found in these realms. Because indeed, these transcendent dimensions are purported to hold the fundamental truths that ostensibly cause or code for, or otherwise explain the ambiguous, uncertain world of our direct experience. The quest for ultimate truth stays focused on these theoretical dimensions inaccessible to direct perception. As a result, more and more of us come to assume that these abstract realms are more true, more fundamental, more real than this palpable and emotion-drenched world that we inhabit with our breathing bodies, this breathing earth. But this assumption, this tendency to explain the lived world by evidence, by reference to dimensions hidden behind or beyond that world, actually inverts the demonstrable state of affairs. This is the argument. I mean, after all, even our most brilliant scientists have no continuous experience of these other dimensions. The subatomic world, or the neuronal world with the synapses. The empirical evidence regarding these realms is inevitably fragmentary and piecemeal, because science encounters these alien scales of existence only by means of complex, specialized instrumentation, and only for brief moments, when usually during highly structured experiments, particular reactions are registered by such instruments for a moment or another moment. And so, or specific measurements are recorded by means of these instruments. And so we get these fragmentary glimpses, very momentary, very brief. Individual scientists then must imaginatively fill in the vast gaps between these fragmentary glimpses in order to gain some sense of how these hidden worlds really function, how quarks are held within a proton or a neutron, or how particular stretches of DNA influence other stretches of the same chromosome, or how the dense neural lattice of branching axons and dendrites continually interacts with itself, or how black holes transform time, Our experts construct an image of what is actually unfolding at these other scales of existence only by extrapolating from piecemeal evidences, by hypothesizing various modes of activity and interaction, by basically filling in the gaps. But the manner in which we fill those yawning gaps in the empirical data is inevitably shaped by perceptual proclivities, habits, and expectations, and ways of seeing that are borrowed from our ongoing and taken for granted engagement with the one realm that we inhabit with the whole of our animal bodies. From the enigmatic world of ground, wind, and rain that commonly meets our senses as we daily go about our lives. Every coherent image that we can have of those other ostensibly more objective dimensions is necessarily rooted, then, in the animate world of our ongoing experience. Everything we have come to believe about those ostensibly more fundamental scales of the real is inevitably dependent upon our everyday engagement with the world at this scale, the very scale of existence to which our senses are tuned. In the palpable world in which we commonly find ourselves, the entities that meet our senses are not quarks and protons, but rather maples and mosquitoes and slowly eroding mountains. Not DNA base pairs or neuronal synapses, but rather people and frogs and the distant sound of thunder. Although we regularly try to explain this moody and difficult world by appealing to those more mathematically precise realms hidden behind the perceivable surroundings, it is ultimately our ongoing relation to the local earth that holds the key to all those abstract and provisional worlds. Do you follow what I'm trying to say? I'm speaking about the relation of the scientific realms that we now all engage in regularly as we read the news or as we do our research, but the relation between those worlds and the world of our direct experience. This world that is always being explained as a product of what's going on at the subatomic world. That's where the real truth is. No, the real truth is it's in the nucleus of our cells because it's in the genome. That's what's causing everything. We're always explaining this world by relation to those other worlds. That's where the deep causes are. In fact, that's ass backwards. It's this world alone that can explain those others. I'll wind up these last minutes by taking another angle on the same thing. It seems to me a terribly important thing, and I'm very grateful for you sitting through this fairly long rap and argument, but it's a damned important one for us to begin to get, and it's too hard to grasp in this exceedingly abstract era. Although it eludes the awareness of many practicing scientists, it's a truth long implied by the world-shifting work of that most admirable scientist, Charles Darwin. For some 2,500 years, alphabetic civilization had claimed a special origin for humankind, asserting that humans were divinely fashioned to serve as God's representatives on earth. Darwin's audacious theory, of course, suggested and provided convincing evidence that humankind, on the contrary, had been formed like every other species over the long course of evolution. The theory of evolution by natural selection made evident that we too are animals, created not by an external divinity, but evolved from a group of primate ancestors, and more anciently from a lineage of small mammals themselves derived much earlier from an ancestral line of fish dwelling deep in the watery depths. So Darwin had rediscovered the deep truth of totemism, the animistic assumption common to countless indigenous cultures, but long banished from polite society, that humans are closely kindred to all the other creatures. and indeed have various other animals as our direct ancestors. Here was a form of totemism transposed into the modern world. The totemic insight now translated into the language of descent by natural selection from a common ancestor. This modern version no longer saw different persons as the offspring of different animals or totemic ancestors, but it recognized all of us two-leggeds as ultimately derived from a common lineage of creatures. In the wake of Darwin's dazzling insights, we gradually learned to consider all humans as members of a common family, although, to be sure, we hardly treat other peoples as such. But the wild totemic implication of Darwin's insights has taken even longer to surface in our collective awareness, no doubt because it threatens our cherished belief in human transcendence. But it's an inescapable implication of the evolutionary insight. We humans are corporeally related by direct and indirect webs of evolutionary affiliation to every other species that we encounter. Moreover, it's not just other animals and plants and protozoa that have contributed during the long unfolding of evolution to the unique structure of the human organism, but also the fluid ocean and the various rocks that compose the soils and the way the mountains gather clouds above the high ridges. These other earthly forms are not extrinsic to human life. They are not arbitrary or random aspects of a world we just happen to inhabit or plop down in. Rather, they are the constitutive powers that summoned us into existence. And hence they are the secret allies, the totemic guides of all our actions. They are as much within us as they surround us. They compose the wider, deeper life of which our bodies are a part. Because if we accept Darwin's insights and concede that the human species has taken shape like the others over the long course of evolution, we have to acknowledge that the enveloping earth is the very matrix within which these bodies and brains came to acquire their current form. Our senses have co-evolved with the diverse textures, shapes, and sounds of the earthly sensuous. Our human eyes have evolved in subtle interaction with other eyes, as our ears are now tuned by their very structure to the howling of wolves and the honking of geese and the thrumming of crickets. While gliding in huge schools through the depths of the amniotic oceans, or while crawling upon our bellies from puddle to puddle as fish trying to find a way to breathe until we can get to the next bit of water there, or while racing beneath the grasses as tiny nocturnal mammals, or swinging from branch to branch as long-tailed primates, our bodies have steadily formed themselves in dynamic interaction with the manifold shapes and rhythms of this animate earth. Our nervous systems, then, are wholly informed by the particular gravity of this sphere, by the way the sun's light filters down through Earth's atmosphere, and by the cyclical tug of the Earth's moon. In a thoroughly palpable sense, we are fashioned of this earth. Our attentive bodies co-evolved in rich and intimate rapport with the other bodily forms, the animals, plants, mountains, rivers, that compose the shifting flesh of this breathing world. And hence, it is the elemental earth that has lent us our particular proclivities and gifts, our specific styles of behavior, our modes of perception, our unique habits of thought and contemplation have all been informed by the complex nature of this many-voiced world. And so the earthly biosphere provides the inescapable template for our experience of any other realm that we may discover or devise. Whether we are pondering the unfathomably vast galactic clusters revealed by a new generation of radio telescopes, or mathematically exploring the submicroscopic realm of vibrating 10-dimensional strings, we cannot help but interpret whatever we glimpse of those worlds according to predilections derived from the one world in which we uninterruptedly live. Predispositions necessarily instilled over the course of evolution by the shapes and patterns of our terrestrial habitat. So, for instance, our surmises regarding the subtle function of neural processes in the brain and the way these processes give rise to consciousness are profoundly constrained by the fact that the brain did not evolve in isolation from our sensing body in its ongoing intercourse with the world, with the earth. The human brain did not unfold in order to understand itself. Rather, it evolved its complex organization as a consequence of our sensorial engagement with the complex, dangerous, and ever-shifting landscapes that surrounded us. And hence, this brain has a natural proclivity to help us orient and interact with these enigmatic earthly surroundings. Whenever we attempt to focus the thinking brain back upon itself, upon its own neural structure and functioning, or upon other dimensions similarly hidden from our common experience, whether subatomic or cosmological, the brain can't help but bring those predispositions to bear, anticipating gravity and ground and sky where they are not necessarily to be found, interpreting data according to the elemental constraints common to our two-legged species, yielding an image of things profoundly informed by our animal body and its accustomed habitat. So there is much, to be gleaned from our investigations into other scales and dimensions, but we constantly err by assuming our studies provide an objective assessment of the way those other scales really are in themselves, independent of the relationships that we curious two-legged primates sustain with those transcendent realms. The super small and the ultra vast spaces steadily explored by the sciences can never explain this lovely and problem-ridden world that we daily inhabit, since those abstract spaces are largely woven out of the perceptual fabric of this very world. Certainly, our explorations in those other dimensions can offer us clues, new approaches to the land around us, new ways of looking at a forest or listening to a volcanic tremor. They can spark new insights into the lives that surround us, new ways of understanding ourselves, or if we choose, of altering ourselves. But ultimately, it is only the lived, felt relationships that we daily sustain with one another and with the sensuous terrain that supports us that can teach us the use and misuse of all our abstractions. Despite all our giddy technological dreams, this vast and inscrutable land, drenched by the rains and parched by the summer sun, remains the ultimate ground and the final horizon of all our science. It is not a set of determinate or random mechanisms, this breathing land. It is not a stock of resources waiting to be utilized by us, nor a storehouse of raw materials waiting to be developed. It is not an object. It is, rather, the very body of wonder, a shuddering field of intelligence in whose round life we participate. And if today this dreaming land has been forgotten behind a clutch of glowing screens that intercept the fascination of our focused eyes, if it's been eclipsed by styles of speaking that deaden our senses, and by machinic modes of activity that stifle the eros between our body and the leafing forests, then it is time to listen underneath all these words for the animal stirrings that move within our limbs and our swelling torsos. It is time to unplug our gaze from the humming screen, walking out of the house to blink and pee under the river of stars. There are new stories waiting in the cool grasses and new songs. Thanks.
We have time for some questions. Yes.
Hi, David.
Hi.
of biology, I was reflecting on my own experiences, and I had a completely different experience. The more I got into it, through biochemistry and cell biology, the more I felt a sense of opening to the world and a sense of reciprocity. And I'm thinking about what made my experience different from yours. And what I'm thinking of now is that it must have been my imagination. So now, as someone who's concerned with how we go about the way of teaching science, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and maybe what the role of imagination is.
Well, I think one difference also might be our teachers.
They use the same language, probably.
And the way it was being taught. And I have to own up, I didn't really mean this rap to sound as harsh as it did toward the sciences. I wasn't just a student of biology then, but I've stayed a student of biology, and it's informed, well, I guess when I was rapping about Darwin, maybe that begins to become apparent, but I take much of my own understanding from the natural sciences, and they've informed me so deeply. But I know so well that everything I learn in the sciences, I have to test it against and bring it into relation with my felt sensory experience of the earth around me. And it sounds like you're doing that. And you were doing that. And so your question then was about?
Well, I'm wondering, how do we teach science to create such an experience, to bring people into the world?
Well, it's very much what I guess I'm trying to suggest here is that you have to always translate the abstractions into the language of felt experience. Not that one has to be, starting with that translation all the time, but always be making the link, it seems to me, to our direct experience of the world as it meets our unaided senses. And if one can't make that link, I don't know. I don't know the worth of teaching something that has no relevance to my direct felt experience of what's there. I guess I'm also, well, I don't know. That's at least my first thought. I'm kind of tired. So a richer answer is not leaping to my mind, but yeah.
Anyone else? Yes?
Well, if teaching science is partly dissecting the frog, how do you bring that? Would you say, well, the frog, if it was alive, would feel pain now, so you feel pain in your own body? I'm curious about it.
If teaching biology involves dissecting frogs, then ask again.
How do you make the student feel that connection with the physical world? Do you say this frog would feel pain the same way you'd feel pain?
If I'm dissecting the frog, I hope it's not feeling too much pain. I'm still trying to get your question. Dissecting frogs is kind of a weird thing to be doing, yeah. But it's a necessary thing, I guess, also dissecting the human body to learn about things. As long as we stepped outside and look at actual frogs and see how they live in the places where they live, okay, and know that that's the source, that's the life, that's the biology we're studying. It's the study of life. We're not just going to study it by analyzing the corpse. And think that what we learn from that anatomized corpse explains the living organism. That's backwards. the living organism, thrumming there in the fields, that frog chorus that's been dwindling across the street as the moisture's been drying up where I live. But that's the real. That's the thing that we need to keep bringing ourselves back into relation with, that wonder. And so just teaching the sciences always as ways into, back at questions, forms of investigation, ponderings that grow out of our relation to the rest of the real, to the biotic world around us. How do we do this? Or how can we better understand this humpback or that wetland? Well, I need to ask some questions. I need to do some fresh research or build on some experiments that have already been done in order to, and I mustn't forget, to come back into relation with that humpback or that wetland. But we're currently, a lot of our science education and a lot of the folks who are graduating from these programs are thinking that they're, what they're studying, they're trying to piece together the truth of just how a humpback works, or just how that wetland really works in itself. Just what is it? What makes it tick? Whatever. And that just doesn't make sense to me anymore. Because we ourselves are animals co-evolved with the wetlands and the grasslands and the oceans and the humpbacks. We can't get a pure, clear, objective take on just what is a humpback whale in itself from a God's eye perspective. All we can get is how that wetland or whale shows itself to this two-legged, two-armed primate creature that we are. So the truth our sciences are after cannot be a truth of a finished blueprint of how the world works. The truth that we study is that we're after is the truth, a relational truth. The question we're tracking has to be something like, how can we and this wetland both thrive in proximity to one another without destroying one another? How can we, two-leggeds and the humpbacks, both live well in this world and make room for each other? How can we better accord appropriate space for these other creatures? That truth, what the Buddhists would call right relationship, that's what our science is for. To help us learn how to better relate to our world, not how to figure out what the world is in itself, as though it were an object and we were a pure mind looking at it from outside. It feels to me like a very different tone to scientific education as currently practiced. Should we take one more?
One more, and then we can continue the conversation out back with some refreshments.
You've spent so much time with sorcerers and shamans and religious folk. If they were to take a trip up to Maroon Bells, as many of us did the other day, do they see things differently than you do? Do they see the mountains and the water and in the clouds in a different way?
No. I don't think they see it that differently from the way any of us do. They see it with their own human senses. But they speak it, and they take care in their speaking not to insult the mountains, the forests, the creek, the winds. So they acknowledge all the time that these are beings, and that each being has its own inexhaustible weirdness, its own unfathomable mystery. And it's easy to do that. Any child can help us do that. Simply dropping the notion that there is any, neat division between animate and inanimate matter. And realizing that it's all animate. That is, it all moves. It's just some things move a lot slower than other things, like the ground or the mountain, but it's a being with its own way in the world, its own life that draws me into participation with it. I think to the extent that we begin speaking like that, our senses wake up. That's what I was trying to suggest in the first part of this paper, that to speak of a world that is alive through and through, and of a field of intelligences, each being its own vitality, its own strangeness, its own otherness, is to speak in accordance with our animal senses. And so to come back inside the world and to feel the world as something that speaks to us and begin to hear it again. So I guess that's what I was trying to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.